And welcome back to Think Global Do Justice. My name is Brandon Stiver. Good to be with you guys once again here on a sunny summer afternoon. I am joined by a return guest, a friend, a colleague, a leader within the global humanitarian space, Michael Cerna, who is, of course, with the Accord Network. You guys are familiar with the Accord Network, talking about them all the time. They are core partners for the podcast, and we're grateful for all that they do to uphold Christian humanitarian and relief work throughout the world. Speaking of Accord Network, we want to make sure that you guys know that the One Accord conference is coming up in October. And if you use the code GLOBAL, you'll get a discount on those tickets. So hope you can make it to Washington, D.C. Always a great crew. I've talked about this before. You guys have heard me say, but one of the best newsletters that goes out is every Thursday. If you just want to keep up to date and see, hey, what are some things that I should have my eyes on as somebody who's engaged in this space? The Thursday 3 that Michael sends out from Accord Network is great. We've used it to kind of do some of these roundup calls, if you will, in the past. So I'm excited to get into some of the stuff that's happening right now. So Michael, welcome back to Think Global Do Justice. How you doing today, man?
Thanks, Brandon. I'm great. Thank you. You're very kind, always very generous with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, likewise. I was thinking about you and thinking about one of the areas I saw in the Thursday 3, just going to hop right in. We were talking about microfinance is something that we've talked about a lot on the show. We want to talk about strengthening families, developing communities. Access to capital is a core need. And there was an interesting article recently in the Wall Street Journal that was uh, applying some critiques, if you will. Some of them
hmm
fair, some of them maybe a little off base. We'll kind of discuss that. But, a mutual friend and colleague, Peter Greer, had an interesting response. I thought it would be an interesting jumping off point, especially since you formerly worked with Hope International
hmm
and have a lot of insight into microfinance. I would love, this was one of the things that was in the Thursday 3. Michael, maybe if you could just kind of, and I'll have it linked in the show notes, but what were some of the critiques that were coming from the Wall Street Journal around microfinance?
A lot of fair things, like you said. That there were some great, just heartbreaking stories talking about interest rates that have gotten out of control, families that had to put up their land to participate in certain programs and then ended up losing that, or they had to get their kids out of school. Just by and large, the big picture critique was that it wasn't. Not only was it not the silver bullet that maybe it was originally cast as, but it probably hasn't made a notable dent in global poverty at all, I think was the language they used, which again, a bit unfair with how they set that up, I think. But all fair critiques of certain parts of you struggle to call it an industry. It's very, very broad and
Right.
diverse. But yeah, certainly very fair of a lot of the practices that you can see with microfinance around.
I mean, when we think about international development, I mean, we go straight to thinking some of the earliest wins were around the Grameen Bank and just,
Right, right.
I mean, Yunus, what's his last name? Why am I
Yeah.
blanking on his
Yeah,
name?
Muhammad Yunus, yeah.
Yeah, Mohammed Yunus. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it set course for
Mm,
what it could look like to give the poor a step up, right?
that's
And of
right.
course, we've had so many, Christian organizations that have applied that as a part of their model, right, for for
hmm
for serving the poor. And a lot of the focus in the Wall Street Journal article was specifically around loans. I mean, when you think about, okay, you want to say access to capital,
hmm
right? You want to say loans, investing in business, all of these things, like those are all positive words. There is another side to it, which is says, well, what is that? That's debt,
That's right.
right? And that was kind of the cornerstone of their critique was around debt. We know that people default on loans. And there's also some people that are in the space that are maybe not looking out for the best
hmm
of the people that are taking out those loans. You speak to that a little bit, just kind of like what does this look like on the ground, when people are trying to figure out, well, I have a business idea, how do I actually finance that?
Oh boy, it's we have examples just from my own experience in Southeast Asia, Central America, wherever. I think it's key to remember that the alternative to the institutions that are offering savings groups or microfinance, and I think Peter Greer got on this. It's not another bank or another competitor. It's a loan shark, informal lender, often people that are very exploitative. And I mean, I saw in Southeast Asia as an example, it's not even necessarily always about a business. It's, I need loans because I'm, a farmer, and the latest landslide or typhoon or whatever it was wiped out my crops, and this is how my family survives. It's how I make a living. So I have to get money from somewhere. And thankfully, in quotes, there are people willing to give that for a steep price. And I mean, gosh, you could go on deep rabbit trails about this is a core cause behind the trafficking, human trafficking problem, where it's often they're not they're not giving away, they're not even taking loans. They're just giving up children, giving up a daughter to go into the industry so that they can get cash and get out of debt, or at least meet their immediate need, and often make debt worse. So yeah, it's again, it's a legitimate concern and critique, and a serious risk for people.
Well, and it's not dissimilar. So if, I'm here in Tacoma, Washington, there's certain neighborhoods that are more affluent than others and so forth.
Hmm.
If I go to certain areas of Tacoma, I'm going to see, oh, yeah, getting cash advance and like all of this stuff,
Hmm.
like in certain neighborhoods, right? And what do we call that? We call that predatory lending,
That's
right?
exactly right. Yeah.
And that's not dissimilar among, the global poor, where,
Hmm.
I mean, that's kind of what you're describing already. I until I read um, Peter's response, I was not even realizing that sometimes those two practices could be conflated, right? We hear
Hmm.
microfinance and we think, hey, access to capital, right?
That's right.
And whether that be at kind of like the household level or like small to medium enterprises, this is access to capital for people that are otherwise shut out of global banking and so forth. I had never thought that that could actually be conflated with predatory lending. Is that
Mm.
something that you came across when you were
Well,
working in microfinance? Like that had not even dawned on me.
yes, honestly though, it goes back to my childhood because I grew up in a very, very impoverished neighborhood here outside of Atlanta. And, my father was a first generation immigrant, and we were very aware of predatory lending practices just in our neighborhood. So yeah, that's the real risk. It's interesting. I think Liz Ha may have touched on this, or perhaps it was Peter, but just talking about the why behind what you're doing. Because if you break down a predatory lending model, it's actually a great business model because you have capital and you're in communities where that's what the big uh, lack is for people. They don't have access to capital, and so you can lend someone money with these huge interest rates, knowing they're never going to get out from under those loans. So you just got a consistent revenue source from taking advantage of people who are desperate. So it's like a pure capitalist business mindset. What a great model that is. It's consistent revenue that is very protected, and you have all the safeguards and control in your hand. So that again, that's sort of the irony I find, that when we talk about the global poor, and we just need to, create new jobs or create access to capital, find sources of revenue. If you haven't really dug into the why and had honest conversations about the purpose behind your business or mission, well, sure, why wouldn't you go do that? It's a great business model, and that's the problem.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's effective. It's effective in terms of turning profit, and that's why people do it. I'm going to read just quickly from Peter's article, which was posted on Medium. Microfinance can be used to exploit. It can also be used to empower. Broad critiques that collapse an entire sector into its worst examples fail to distinguish between predatory models and responsible ones. I thought that
Bingo.
that was very succinct. I think
Hmm.
it's easy within, even a credible, obviously, Wall Street Journal is a very incredible source, but it's easy to kind of conflate all of that down and kind of boil things down to their worst potential outcome, right? And I think that
Yes.
that's kind of what was happening. But the emphasis on what does it look like to do this responsibly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And are there stories where people had access to capital and they didn't default on their loans and they did pay back and they increased, all the different things that we look at, whether, that in international development, increase household income, increase
Mm-hmm.
access to education for the children, healthcare, etc. And that's what it can be, right? And that's of course what we shoot for. Another interesting thing was that microfinance is more than just microloans, right?
Oh, yes.
There's so many other things, saving groups. Talk a little bit. I mean, talk a little bit about just kind of some of those other aspects that just kind of get glossed over when we only focus on the loan aspect.
Yes, it is always interesting to me that that takes center stage because if you talk to anyone who's in the broad sector of creating access to capital, loans are extremely, they're so risky because you need institutions for that. And most communities don't even have the bandwidth or capacity to take advantage of it. And most of your investors, if you're going that route, they don't want to take on that risk because the risk of failure is so high. So yeah, savings groups. Again, Liz Ha over at Five Talents talked a good bit about their model. I think Missy Williams over at Seed Effect did as well. They don't require any land to be put up or anything like that. But Five Talents is a great example of their groups are all community led. They are savings led, and that's just a model of bringing individuals from a community together to pool their resources. And then as opportunities come up for business ideas or particular needs, they're able to pull those resources together. And I mean, you could get into a lot of fine detail about how much difference that makes over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And again, those are three organizations that would be great to dig into: Five Talents, Seed Effect, Hope
Yeah.
International. Really transformational stuff. If the expectations are honest on the front end, and that's where I think our space can often fall short, is our marketing and the way we're communicating expectations around poverty aren't as nuanced as they need to be, and it just makes it ripe for someone to critique the sector as a whole because you're failing to meet a need, or you're failing to make an impact that you were never aiming to do in the first place.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think with those savings groups, when we talk about asset-based community development, that's probably one of the clearest examples. Because when we talk about those savings groups, I remember seeing this when I was in my residency in Rwanda, was seeing this kind of firsthand where and it was primarily women in that particular group, come together and they have their ledger and they're chipping in, and then people are pulling out loans. And it's like literally, it's all assets from within the community.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
yet people are using those groups to actually, take a step forward in their lives. And of
Yeah.
course, yeah, look, I mean, in the US, yeah, like you said, there's always risk attached to loans, but sometimes an outside loan can have in a positive way, a disproportional opportunity, for
Mm-hmm.
someone as well. So that has a role. But those saving groups, or even just some of the business schooling,
Oh
like those
gosh,
types of
yes.
things that are also wrapped in with microfinance, can have a profound impact.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot. One of the other things, which maybe we'll get into, but one of the examples of this that you also shared in another Thursday 3 recently was, refugee entrepreneurialism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, well, that's an example of business practices that are allowing people that were behind to get ahead. And there's
Mm-hmm.
just so much more to it than just the loan piece.
Well, for sure. And there's a fundamental difference between a credit-based system and a savings-based system. I mean, credit's instant, and that's great because it can speed up the route that someone is taking to get out from under whatever debts they're in. It also means that you're dependent on ongoing capital that's coming externally. So it's a trade-off. As with everything else, or as with most things anyway, there are trade-offs in whatever decision you take. The trick is being, again, honest with expectations to whoever is putting money in, and then noting that they have a different pace. If I love your story about Rwanda, I'm sure you probably came into that well into their program, and after it had been established for a
Oh
while,
yeah.
and they built the system and the checks and all that. That's amazing. It took years, I bet, to
Yeah.
get to
Yeah.
where it was that solvent and strong. And it's beautiful. But again, if you're wanting some quick fix to poverty, that's not it, and
Yeah.
that's fine.
And there isn't one. There isn't.
Right, there isn't one. Yeah. And I would say that's often, again, that's one of the hardest things. That's one of the great temptations of our work is to communicate as if our work is more than it is. That's one thing I appreciate so much about Peter and Liz and Missy, all three of them, is they're very honest. Hey, if you're part of a hope savings program, for example, we are not saying that this is going to eliminate poverty in the whole community and that, all of our health outcomes will be improved. No, 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 no. It's a narrow, very focused intervention that is making massive impact in that lane. And so we're going to be honest about what it is and what it is not doing for the lives of the people we work with.
Really well said. As I think about things that take time, I'm thinking of another article that you shared recently that came from Anthony Bradley. He's a evangelical educator.
Mm-hmm.
Was at King's College, and he posted something recently on Substack that I thought was really interesting, and it was specifically around education. Now, I'll just kind of acknowledge, and I did not plan this. I was taking my kids to VBS this morning, or kids camp as they call it now. I can't say VBS
That's
anymore, or Sunday school, or any of
right.
these terms. But I even have my Multnomah Jessup
Oh, there we
University.
go.
So it is interesting. So I teach at Vanguard University on the side, which is one of the few Christian colleges that is growing. It was actually one of the ones. There was a recent article in Christianity Today that Anthony Bradley actually refers to, where Vanguard's one of the few that are growing, and yet
Mm.
he was talking about how King's College, where he was at, recently closed, and we see this with others, right? And it's an interesting space for me, and one I'll just say. This segment will probably be buttressed by an advert for Multnomah
Good, good. Let's go.
Seminary, because I'm a big believer. I'm a big believer in Christian higher ed, certainly in regards to missiology and international development. And I know this is something that you also are invested in. And I teach at Crown College here in Tacoma at a satellite campus. So this is not inconsequential for me, but it was
Hmm.
really interesting hearing from Dr. Bradley and just some of what he had seen from the inside of being in a college that was slowly or suddenly or maybe both kind of coming apart at the seams. Why was this particular article something that you kind of wanted to highlight to the international development sector?
Yes, great question because it's not directly tied to our work. I guess the general connection is that's where we recruit a lot of future people who or people who work in this sector in the future. But yeah, there are a few things. Number one, higher education in general could be a good example of how there are good ways to do things and bad ways to do things. And maybe even more than that, there are certain ways to steward good times. What I mean is, so I'm in my early 40s. I graduated in the mid 2000s, and that was peak, student loan era, where they're just sort of handing out tens of thousands of dollars to anyone who wanted to go to college because they asked for it, which is a different discussion. But there were also, thousands of degrees that you could go get at university. And there wasn't necessarily clarity around, well, how is this going to help, future career opportunities or whatever. And so it was something of a bubble. University system was something of a bubble, even in the Christian higher ed space. And now we're coming out of that and being met by the rise of AI, which is just completely changing education in general. And so it's just an interesting macro level look of what happens when a particular sector or area of work gets hit by, number one, a disruptive technology, and then also has to wrestle with its core purpose. Is our core purpose, for example, to offer education to as many people as possible and create as many degrees as we can so that people are able to find their passion, so to speak. I know we're similar ages. That's probably something we heard a lot. Go find your passion when you're going to school and all that. Or is
Dude,
there
we
something
we came
different?
of age during the Obama,
Oh my gosh,
I'm the
yeah.
same. I graduated in '08, from a
Yeah.
Christian
Yeah.
evangelical university. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And the
That,
rise of the megachurch messaging and
yeah.
changing the world type stuff. So within our sector, I see a similar discussion that's starting to be had. And Dr. Bradley, the core thing that he touched on was sort of the mission and purpose behind higher ed in general. Same thing for our sector. It's very easy, whether we're talking about working in data in our space or being a CEO and the management principles, it's very easy to dehumanize our work because you get stuck in I need to serve donors and I need to focus on my communications and I'm seeing all this data around poverty and change and you forget the compassionate side, the human side of that. These are actual people's lives that we're stepping into, and we're having an impact one way or the other, however intentional and however aware. We're changing people's lives, not always for the better, to be honest, sometimes. And why are we doing that? You take for granted, you just assume there's a lot of assumed knowledge of, oh, we know why, and we haven't lost sight of that. But then you see some of the practices, you see some of the hiring practices, you see some of the ways that we change our mission, perhaps, and you think, well, maybe we actually have lost sight of that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that this, the last couple of years certainly has kind of been a microcosm of where we have to kind of determine, like, well, why are we doing this? It's something that I've
Yeah.
been thinking a lot about lately, and
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting. I going back to the mid 2000s, when I was at Vanguard and was going to a mega church in Orange
Mm-hmm.
County, Rock Harbor, and in that kind of it was, it was kind of, Rock Harbor wasn't seeker sensitive. It was a mega church, but it was kind of coming into the missional movement. And um, we, that's where I felt that call, but it was really from a missions lens more than a
Mm.
global development lens, right? That kind of
Mm-hmm.
came later. And that's something that I've just been thinking about and is, look, if our core thing is Luke 4, like Jesus comes in and he opens up the scroll and says, "Hey, this is good news for the poor." Like
Mm.
if that's kind of our impetus, then maybe it is sustainable. But if our impetus is like, you know, we're doing it for the money, or I don't know. There's such a
Yep.
tension, obviously.
Yes.
Like, but
I want to make the impact.
right,
Me.
right.
I want to
Yeah,
be the
exactly.
say.
Yeah, yeah, that's real. Let me ask you this, in terms of the education piece. Um, when I graduated, I thought I was going to go into teaching. Obviously, I ended up working overseas, specifically within child welfare and kind of community mobilization space.
Mm.
Still work in the nonprofit space, community development, etc. But it wasn't until later that I said, actually, I want to go into, global development
Mm.
studies, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then that's when I decided to go to Multnomah. And I'm kind of like, I gathered so much from being in that particular education program. Now, fast forward to 2026, and we have undergrads or graduate students that, and we have these degree programs: intercultural studies, foreign affairs, global development, missiology, all of these areas of study that relate to, Christian humanitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that those are necessary, unnecessary? Like we talk about this demographic cliff that,
Mm.
Dr. Bradley talks about, you and I were born, at a time where women were averaging 2.3 births, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now it's
Mm-hmm.
down to 1.6. There's going to be consolidation. We already see
Mm-hmm.
it happening. That's what so much of his article was about. But what does that mean for our areas, right? Because even in the
Mm-hmm.
article, he says, look, some of your programs might not be successful, but what
That's
about
right.
serving the global poor? Like how necessary is it that we even have these types of programs so that we can be professional in how we live out that integral mission?
I think you could almost ask that question again 5 times to really catch the weight of what you're saying, because that professional part, I think, so that's what was missing from our time. It's how can you make an impact? How can you serve people? And those are very good questions to ask. There's also just a really practical skill-based side of it. What skills are needed to work in this space? And I'll tell you this, when I first graduated when I finished grad school, would that have been '09 or 2010? It was right in the middle of the recession. I remember applying for a job at World Relief that was, as an internship, very low pay, and I got one of those emails of, you're one of 500 people or whatever that applied for it, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna have a job. And it was a real wake up call for me. Of I had studied international affairs, I was doing development economics in grad school, I worked overseas, and now I come back and I'm sitting there asking, well, what skills do I actually have? Not knowledge. What skills do I have? And now you fast forward to 2026, where I could go to Claude or Chat GPT and ask them to summarize any book that I had in grad school and give me a 2-page outline of whatever it is, the most important points that would be transferable for a job. Well, why doesn't a 19-year-old just go do that and save the tens of thousands of dollars that they could spend at a school? Now, I'm not
They
saying
do
that's
do that,
necessarily
and then they
right or
submit it in
wrong.
my children at risk
Right. Yeah,
class.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And so it's, if the program, to a couple things, if it's not skills based, I think it's going to be hard for them to survive. And then number two, that's Accord. We try to do a good job of integrating universities who send people into this space with our community. If you come to One Accord, we have a whole student night where it's like, come just share a meal with people that have been in this space for 5, 10, 15 years, figure out what their journey was like. And you're going to teach them something, they're going to teach you something. Because if those universities don't have a sense of what the skills are, how the industry is changing, how is the AI disrupting things, it's going to be really hard to compete with a sector that is, not least of all, becoming more driven by thought leaders in the majority world. And that's again, that in and of itself, why would I hire Michael Cerna or Brandon to go work in East Africa when I have Kenyans who are more educated, local, better equipped, have more skills, and cost a fifth of the price? That's a hard thing to wrestle with.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, and if that's kind of the spot that someone's in, well, maybe they shouldn't
Maybe
hire
they shouldn't.
Michael or
Right.
Brandon. Maybe they
Yeah.
should hire that, Baraka
Mm-hmm.
in Kenya,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
like,
And maybe those programs should shift. Like I would love to see a program coming out around leveraging AI for, program design or for marketing. We often think of, whether it's Hope International or Seed Effect, we think of the program side of an organization. That's maybe 1/3. What about all the operations work that's going in on the accounting side, HR, finance, internal audits? What about all the fundraising on marketing and donor development and sales? Again, it goes back to, do I want to be the person that's in a particular community being the center of the program design, or do I want to see those people lifted out of poverty? And they aren't separate necessarily, but if it's more of the latter, I'm very fine being a fundraiser and finding donor dollars who can help make that impact, even if I'm not the one living in Rwanda or whatever. Um, but that's me talking after 20 years of working in
right,
this space and some very hard lessons.
right. And to me, part of what could potentially, just something to kind of monitor, is how connected in that scenario are we with our brothers and sisters in other countries. So in a certain
Mm,
regard, we could just say, hey, we're just going to have that be there, and the job's going to be there, and he's going to lead it, and he's Kenyan or he's Guatemalan or he's whatever.
hmm
But is there something lost when we don't have us going over there or them coming
Yes.
over here? You know what I mean? Like, and I say
Oh,
that
in a
as,
deep way, I know what you mean.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you're the son of an immigrant. I'm the father of an immigrant. Like my son is
Mm,
Tanzanian, my oldest is,
yeah.
and like thinking about just that need for not just like a cross cultural connection, but also like those are family. You know what I
You're
mean?
hitting on a
So
big point here, Brandon. The two things about this. One is, if you lose that, it goes back to my point about looking at data, for example, forgetting the people. If you lose that human touch and connection, you forget that you're not just designing a program. Here's an example. I remember working in Indonesia. We had a savings group program. This was before I worked at Hope International with a group that's now merged with 410 Bridge. And we had a savings group program where part of the frustration was that people would, after a year or two in the program, they'd start making real savings and they have increased capital where they could, say, invest in a business or they could pool resources for whatever the community is working toward at that time, but they wouldn't. And it's because they had family who went through a crisis. And so they took that savings that they had that was originally aimed at a business and gave it to their family. Now, as a follower of Jesus, that's a tough one because how can I go into this community and say, no, you shouldn't be generous with your family?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And instead, maybe you should be aiming it toward a business. That's a hard thing to say out loud, right? So there's that flexibility of, well, perhaps I got my theology a little wrong, or perhaps I need to adjust the model for the sake of the purpose that I'm there, right? Again, going back to that point. So that's one, just you have to have that connection to the people. Number two, the big culture shift that's happening in our space now is around post-lockdown virtual culture. And I don't think we've yet had a real reckoning and wrestling with how this is impacting the workplace. We have most I would say almost half our CEOs now don't live in the place where the office is.
Hmm.
I don't know what that does, but it does something. I've worked in the office at Hope. I was virtual and I had spent part of the time in office. They are not the same.
No, they're
And the
not.
culture is not the same. The way I'm part of the community is not the same. It's not that it's bad or better or worse, but it's very different.
It's very different, and I've done the same. Living in Tanzania, we established an office for Kingdom Families, which was a program we were running, and that there was something about that, having the social workers come in, having the interns there, sharing a space together. When I moved back to the States, I was working for a nonprofit on the Central Coast, and I had to be in the office every day. And it was a
Mm.
little bit of a drive, but I liked that differentiation. Like, now it's kind of like, okay, I'm work from home. I'm recording from home right now.
Hmm.
If I work from home, but this is also supposed to be the spot that I find respite, like in a certain regards, like I'm always working.
That's right.
And, the organization I work for is a good size Go project. They do great work. They do work internationally. They do work domestically. They're headquartered in Kansas City, and we have a Friday call where all programs come together, the US side, the international side. And I could tell there's a big difference in the experience just from
Oh
that one
yeah.
call where
Oh
I'm
yeah.
on Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever, and I'm like listening in while I make breakfast, and I'm doing that at 9 a.m. So yeah, I didn't have to be in the office or whatever, and I'm technically in a meeting right now, but I can hear
Mm.
people laughing and, having a good time in Kansas
Yeah.
City, and I'm like, oh man, that sounds
Jealous a
fun.
little,
Like, and I know that
Yeah.
they're gonna break bread after this, and I'm just gonna go about my day. Like,
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
different dynamic, man, and it can be isolating, right? Which was another thing that you were writing about. Like, it
Extremely
can be
isolating.
isolating. Yeah,
Yeah. That is, I think it's the most, one of the biggest threats in our space is isolation and disconnection. And that was always a problem. Now we are, again, post lockdown, we are purposefully building out organizations in an isolating model, in an isolating setup where we want to be separated. We want to have that delineation. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad or worse, but you're definitely losing something on that human connection side.
yeah, 100%. I have the one benefit of, and this was actually because, before I worked for Care Portal, I was working for an international nonprofit. That was, focus area was in the global south, but I was living here on the West Coast. And that was one thing that I did enjoy about switching to Care Portal was I live in my impact area again. You know what I mean?
Oh
Which
my
was the
gosh,
case in
that's so
Tanzania.
different.
And for sure, like there's a difference when it's like, okay, we're serving families that, are getting out of that have been housing insecure, or it's foster youth, or it's
Mm,
refugees that have made their way here. Like I don't know. Like, I like that. I like that I get to do that. And I didn't get to do that when I was, senior director over global programs and partnerships, and
Mm,
all the programs are in Haiti and Kenya and,
yeah.
Sierra Leone.
Right. And that goes, I mean, what is an organization? Here's a question I like to ask people, for example. If it's true that we are more isolated and disconnected, the organization has, I think, a responsibility to at least acknowledge that and do something about it. Because if I'm the type of person that I didn't get into this work because I love looking at numbers around poverty or because I like to build management systems. I got into it because of that one experience I had wherever I went in the world or in my neighborhood. And I still think of that woman's eyes when she was telling me about the difficulty she has raising her children. That's what, when I really remember why I'm in this faith, that's what it comes back to. So if we're robbing people of that, I don't know that you can compensate. How are you making up for that? And another area where I see this being problematic is on the conflict side of things, because again, it's like social media. If I go create an anonymous account on Twitter, I can be as mean as I want and angry as I want to anyone because there are no consequences. And
Hmm.
it's not quite that level, but when I'm only ever on a screen with someone, what does conflict look like? Because healthy conflict, and no organization should ever be avoidant to it, but if you have healthy conflict within your organization, without that deep relationship and love for one another, I'm just not going to treat it the same way. I'm not going to care the same way. I'm not going to have the courage and strength to tell you when I'm upset, to push back on you. And we've almost totally taken that out of most organizations' cultures. What does that do for conflict resolution and communication? I don't know that there's no study out there about that
Yeah.
that I've seen.
Do you think that, when those things arise, uh, it kind of can lend itself to people that are just like, all right, I'm just done, and just kind of that quiet quitting, type of aspect, where
Oh
it's just
yeah.
like, you know what, I'm just here by myself anyways, and I have this issue, and we don't really have a healthy resolution process, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna, I'm
Mm-hmm.
heading out. Like, do you think that
Yeah.
happens?
Oh, I know it happens. I know I've seen it. I mean, I don't think anyone would mind my sharing. I've seen it at every organization. It's like being. It's why I avoid. I love mega churches. They have their own benefit to the world. It's part of why I avoid them is because I can disappear and nobody needs to know I'm there. And there are times in my life where I liked that, but when I want to actually be involved, boy, I need to be in a small community. And same thing, if the only time I interact with humans is on a screen with a purposeful meeting and it's, very down to business, why would I stay here with my frustrations and loneliness? Frankly, I could probably go make 10, 20, 30% more doing a somewhat similar job in the private sector. And it's just a job.
Yeah, yeah.
Why not? And that's without even getting into issues with, hiring practices in our sector and the rising costs and all. I mean, gosh, it's there's that quiet quitting movement is starting to hit ours, and I think it's going to be pretty major in the next 5, 10 years.
Well, yeah, there's just so many things that are converging. So yeah, the isolation, the anonymity, and just kind of, again, and you and I have discussed this before, but just the withdrawal from investment into our
Mm,
industry, and what effect is that having? I mean, there's
mm-hmm.
so many different things that are all converging at once here, and yeah, we are also. I think they just had the jobs report, or sorry, there was just a report that was coming out that was saying, hey, inflation is back. It's back on the rise again. Obviously, the ongoing war, and we're recording this in mid-July. It'll release in mid-July. Uh, the war is back on, so that
Yeah.
has an effect on this as well. Um, and we all have families to provide for. I mean, how are you kind of seeing that? Like, this inflation and trying to be competitive, but then you see the mergers, you see the
Mm-hmm.
acquisitions, even within nonprofit space.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what are you kind of making of that?
I was speaking with someone recently who is doing a capital campaign, or they just finished a capital campaign, and where they ended is they had a 15 or 20% rise of revenue that went just to paying their staff to catch up for the increased cost of living over the last 5 years. So again, repeat, they increased their total revenue by 15 or 20% and didn't grow their impact at an organization. They didn't grow the number of people. They just brought salaries up to where they should be. Because now we're, what is it, 5 years out from the lockdown, we're slowly starting to accept that, okay, this wasn't a temporary jump. This is the new normal. And what it, you cost 5 years ago, what it cost to live in LA is what it now costs to live in Atlanta. And what it cost to live in Atlanta 5 years ago is what it costs to live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or Durham. So then you have to ask the question, well, are my staff salaries matching where Atlanta was 5 years ago? Probably not, or are you kind of going back up that chain? Is my salary in Atlanta matching LA prices from 5 years ago? Probably not. So what do you do with that as an organization? It's one thing if you are new to the space and you're going to work for a lower salary, you really love the work, you're fresh out of college, you love the space. Maybe you haven't gotten jaded yet or whatever. But then you start having a family, or the mortgage is looking pretty scary, or my wife can't work for a time. That's
Yeah,
that's tough. That's a
it,
hard thing.
it is. And it kind of feels a little bit like a whack-a-mole, if you will. Because one of the solutions that people will say is like, well, okay, we had our office in, whatever, Philadelphia, Atlanta, LA, Seattle, whatever it is. And now there's this swing in remote work. So yeah, cost of living in Seattle is way too much, but we could just hire it remotely and that person can live in, the
Mm-hmm.
Midwest or whatever, where it's cheaper. And then you just kind of say like, all right, so we're just going to have more remote staff. And hey,
Mm-hmm.
it opens up our potential hiring, potentials because we're going to hire it remote. But then now you have the isolation thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
wait, weren't we a Seattle based nonprofit or weren't we an LA
Yeah.
based nonprofit? I mean, it really kind of seems like, all right, we're going to solve this issue and it's just going to pop another one up
Yes.
somewhere
Yeah.
else, right?
Yeah. And again, back to the why. Why are you making these decisions? Is it because you think this is the way to be most effective or efficient? Okay. Is it because you really want to save costs and you're afraid to communicate to donors why the, 10%, what when somebody asks, "Oh, are you staying 10% under your, total cost, your operating costs that's staying below 10%?" I'm afraid to tell you why that's a bad question. And so I don't want to engage with those difficult conversations, even though that's probably what I should do. Uh, what's the push for it? And it puts, honestly, Brandon, I think that my core prayer every day is around our CEOs and our leaders, because those are not easy questions, and everything is a big trade-off. You go to the isolation part, you're seeing that a lot just on the spiritual formation side of things. Of if I'm 23 coming out of whatever university working at some organization remotely, maybe I had to move and I don't have a church community, but here's a spiritual community because we're doing God's work globally. So is that my new church now? Or, where do I find that? And you're sitting there as a CEO thinking, I'm not a pastor. And maybe they're expecting me to be sort of a spiritual authority figure, but I'm not. And I don't want to be. And that's a really unfair ask. But I kind of have to because they have nowhere else to go. And so, do I put that on my man? And just all these really tough questions that CEOs from 10 years ago, 15 years, they didn't have to wrestle through this. And so I have a deep compassion and care for leaders in this space. I had someone recently who just retired after a 45-year career, and she said that CEOs in the Accord Network relief and development space have the hardest job of any CEO in her lifetime, and she would be scared to death to try to lead an organization right now. That speaks loudly to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone with that level of experience.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and there's such a tension in this as I kind of like think through it because on the one hand, you could look consolidation in Christian higher ed, consolidation in international nonprofits and Christian
Which
humanitarian
can be
work,
great.
which can be great
Can be a really great thing.
in the ways that maybe it refines. I mean, because but if you say, hey, there's less organizations, there's less schools, that doesn't necessarily have a positive connotation. So
Right,
actually,
right.
before I kind of talk about that tension, because the tension is, with the hope that we have and working in poverty alleviation and community development, we are generally people that can be somewhat idealistic. Like, hey, we're going to make this better. We're going to
Mm,
make things progress.
mm.
Kind of talk about that tension, or kind of talk about why is it great, that why can it be great? Why can there be positive aspects to the consolidation that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, the consolidate part of it, gosh, there are really practical things that again, this is why relationship is so important, because I would only say these things to people to their face, because it's a very okay. Maybe I'll start with this. Before I came to Accord, a few jobs back, I was put into an interim CEO role, and I was convinced I was ready for it. I was so critical of my boss before that because he's making all these tough decisions that I didn't have the full picture for. So if he had only listened to me, so many of our problems would have been solved. And then I get in that role and it was awful. I turns out I was not a great fundraiser. I did not know how to manage people. These questions and problems were not as clear cut, black and white as I expected, and I drowned. It almost pushed me out of this sector completely. And I learned through that experience that some people, at least at certain times, aren't built to lead an organization. In the same way that some businesses fail because you make a bad decision about where to set it up or how to pay people or whatever, there are just real reasons, best practices that aren't followed. Same thing in our space, where there are decisions we make as leaders that aren't great, and maybe that's due to inexperience, maybe it's because we don't have the business chops, whatever it is. So wouldn't it be better, again, if your why is to serve those people, again, that woman whose eyes I think of whenever I, remember why I got into space. If my goal is to serve that person, am I willing to say that someone else might do that better and I can support them, even if I'm not leading an organization? Again, it's easy for me to say that when I'm not the founder of something that I started 20 years ago, that might be on its last. It's so easy for me to say that. So I don't want to overplay how simple of a thing that is. But that's part of it. That could be a really great reason to merge. And we've had, 4 or 5 mergers in our space just in the last couple of years. And it's been so amazing to see. But that's, again, it's an identity question too. Hey, I was made to lead this organization. Maybe for a time.
Yeah.
But you have a bigger calling than that. And it's more simple.
And I would even just point people back, on the merger. We had this with LifeWater, and Dave Levan was on talking about their merger not that long ago with Water for Good, right? Yeah. Okay. Being from the Central Coast, I was like, no, LifeWater.
Yeah.
But they actually went with the other name, which was more known in other places. Anyways, it is an interesting thing to consider, and it's happening, and I think it happens more than people realize. But so many different things. All right, Michael, what are some things that you guys are looking at right now with Accord? I know you guys have the AI Summit coming up. Of course, One Accord. What are some things that people can kind of like anticipate from the collaborative that you lead?
Yes, One Accord would be the big one, obviously. It's sort of open invite to anyone who's even interested in this space. I'd like to think we do a good job of creating space for difficult conversations where we challenge each other, we push each other. Some of the things that were working 5 years ago aren't working anymore from a management standpoint, from a people standpoint. Gen Z is so different from my generation and older. That's impacting the workplace big time. I think the biggest one that I pray about most, frankly, is going back to our CEOs. We are launching a mentorship program. We have 5 or 6 leaders who have, they kind of retired out of the space, and they're fortunate enough to be at a point where they can donate some time, and they are forming cohorts with Accord. We're working with Ardent Mentoring to create cohorts for these next generation of leaders, because there are some best practices that the older generation can bring down, and there are some real interpersonal and just personal challenges that new leaders are carrying. They're the first generation in history to be wrestling, again, just whether it's AI or isolation or the donor base changing. Like, you take any one of those and they would be enough. And you have all of that converging at the same time. It's really difficult. So we're doing that. We're doing a board fly-in. If we're going to invest in CEOs or executive directors, we think it's worthwhile to invest in their boards as well. So we're doing a fly-in with both of those at One Accord. And really just these next few years, investing most of my sweat equity, so to speak, into this next generation of leaders who are wrestling with some really tough challenges.
I love that. I know it's already sold out, which is awesome, but what are you guys looking at with the AI Summit? When is that? That's coming up soon, right?
Late August, so about a month from now. Bill Simmons, who I know you're familiar with, he's so brilliant and one of the kindest people you'll ever meet. And he somehow has he's just struck gold with the way that he's using Claude to really equip his staff. It's interesting. A lot of people would look at maybe what Bill's doing and say, "Oh, he's trying to, save costs so that he doesn't have to invest in his people as much." Could not be further from the truth. Bill's bringing a healthy theology to it. He's resourcing his people. He's making his team better for the new economy and the new space that's coming into it. So he, with his generous heart and kindness, he's decided, well, let's do the same for the rest of the sector. So we're bringing in about 45 different leaders from Accord Network to learn directly under him and Albert Chin at Anago AI, and just really dig into some really practical questions. It's not meant to be a theory uh, session. We have a lot of things around theology and theory of AI, and those are very important. We're going to workshop it. Everybody's coming in with a couple of problems that you're having on the administrative level, on the operational side, and we're going to workshop that and use Claude to answer some big questions for you over 48 hours.
I feel like that's the type of content and the type of training that we need, because
Thank
of
you.
course, and I'll point people back to the conversation we had with Albert not that long ago
Yeah.
here on the podcast, because he can dive into the kind of philosophical aspects, but
Mm-hmm.
also the practical aspects. And whether we like it or not, it's here. So how do we
Right.
leverage it, right? And how do we
Yes.
do that in a redemptive way? And I think
Yes.
Bill and Albert are two leaders that can point us in the right direction. So I'm looking forward to that investment in those leaders and continued conversation. So,
Thank
um,
you.
Michael, a pleasure as always. We
Yes,
appreciate
brother.
your leadership within this sector, and looking forward to continuing to see how God continues to move through the Accord Network.
Thank you, brother. Always so grateful to be with you.
Right. And for our listeners, may Almighty God, who created us in his own image, grant us grace to fearlessly contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, that we may reverently use our freedom and employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of God's holy name through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. And we will catch you guys on the next episode of Think Global, Do Justice.